message of this bill.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the International Finance Agreements Amendment Bill. Essentially what this bill does is bring New Zealand legislation into line with the Articles of Agreement in the IMF. The Articles of Agreement are essentially the agreement as to who gets how many votes in the IMF. And from time to time there are changes in the allocation of votes at the IMF, though the United States always retains a veto effectively. And so this piece of legislation is to bring essentially those the votes, the change in the Articles of Agreement at the IMF, so the relative change in votes, to bring New Zealand legislation into line with those changes. However, it does something else, and it's the something else that the Greens disagree with. The something else that it does is that it means that future changes can be done by regulation rather than by legislation. And that is the fundamental change in this piece of law. Now, these changes in relative votes, the Articles of Agreement of the IMF, don't change very often, and we think that it is a good principle to uphold, that wherever possible, that the Parliament should be the ones that change the law rather than the Executive. And so secondary law or regulations that this bill, as it's in front of us now, will enable the Executive to make, the regulations that the Executive will be able to make, essentially means that the Parliament has derogated its decision-making to the Executive in terms of amending signing up to the changes in the Articles of Agreement of the IMF. But those articles don't change very often. So it seems to us there is no need to derogate responsibility from the Parliament to the Executive. And this was, of course, a position that the Labor Party argued quite strongly, but have decided, which is fair enough, that while they have concerns about this aspect of the bill, the Labor Party have decided that they will support the bill overall because they support the broader purpose. It was then with some sadness that I heard the ridiculous attacks from the Labor Party on the Green Party, because we take a principled position whereby we understand the bill, but we disagree with one section of it and have decided to vote against the bill for that reason. The Labor Party, and I respect their decision, have said they disagree with this particular section of the bill, but they've decided to support the bill as a whole. I think that's a perfectly rational decision. People of good mind and of similar beliefs can disagree about things. That's just the nature of politics, and so it should be. In terms of the IMF, I'm probably one of those people that has been highly critical of the International Monetary Fund over many years. Those of you who know your history will know that after Bretton Woods we had the three major financial institutions that were set up, the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, or the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund and the International Trade Organisation. Of course, the International Trade Organisation never appeared because it was vetoed by the US Congress, so we were left with two, and it wasn't until 1995 with the establishment of the World Trade Organisation that the third part of the international structure was established. Now, the thing about the IMF and the World Bank, or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, is that essentially they became captured by what became known as the Washington Consensus. So that was a hard right consensus about a series of policies that should be implemented. And those policies were heavily discredited during the 1997 Asian financial crisis, or rather, well, just Asian crisis, I guess, where particularly a number of Southeast Asian countries got into real trouble. The International Monetary Fund came in and applied the usual Washington Consensus formula, which caused those economies to get into more trouble. And many people who are associated with that and have since spoken out very directly, have said that the Washington Consensus model, the application in the case of the East Asian crisis in 1997, was a catastrophe for those countries. One of the most famous, of course, is Joseph Stiglitz, who was the chief economist at the World Bank, who then became a dissenter. Now, what's happened in terms of the evolution of thinking in the IMF and of course at the World Bank in particular, is there has been a radical move away from the Washington Consensus, which I think is a great thing. And for someone like me who's been highly critical of the International Monetary Fund and what they've done to developing countries over many years, and the terrible poverty and dislocation that the IMF and the World Bank have caused, I for one have celebrated the change in direction of the IMF. And so now I find myself quoting often from IMF documents because the IMF has become much more progressive and interesting, particularly on monetary policy. So those of you who read IMF documents, there is of course a very famous one at the moment by Michael Kumhoff, who's one of the IMF researchers, called the Chicago Plan Revisited. which is all about looking at monetary policy and quite a radical proposal around reforming fractional reserve banking, essentially eliminating fractional reserve banking. It is quite a radical proposal that's come out of some of the researchers of the IMF. It's not actually an IMF paper in the sense that it's fully endorsed by the IMF, but these researchers, Michael Kumhoff in particular, have been going around promoting alternative ways to deal with the current global financial crisis, which involves putting a lot more constraints on banks' ability to print money. Now, the other thing that comes out of I think the IMF that surprises a lot of people is when the IMF says things like most of the money that's generated is generated by the private banks. Most of us, I think, and I was certainly one of these people until reading IMF papers, always assumed that the government created the money. But that's just because I actually didn't follow it closely enough. Whereas the IMF is very clear that it is the private banks that create most of the money. And what the IMF, or at least some of the researchers within the IMF, are now saying is that the government should use its ability to create money so that there's some publicly created money as well as the privately created money, which is most of the money that's created is created by the private banks. This, of course, is a pretty radical proposition. And the IMF, in putting forward this proposition, has certainly been shaking the policy debates around monetary policy all over the world, except in New Zealand, of course, where we're kind of locked into some weird kind of backwater where the government doesn't want to have a debate around any of this kind of stuff. But if you read the international literature, it's pretty good. Lord Turner, the head of the United Kingdom Financial Services Authority, the regulator of the banks in the United Kingdom, has been proposing very similar things to the IMF in many respects. He's been talking about using the public creation of money to fund budget deficits. Quite a radical proposition. Very similar to the proposition that was put forward by Milton Friedman when he talked about helicopter money. And so there is a very lively international debate, which the IMF is in many respects leading, around what we should be doing about monetary policy, and should we leave the entire creation of the money supply in the controls of the private banks. And the IMF has been leading this debate, and I think it's a good debate for us to have, particularly in light of the global financial crisis. What we saw with the GFC was that the private banks created vast quantities of money, or credit, call it what you like, and we are now trying to deal with the hangover from that, if you like, this vast amount of debt and money that was created, which we're now trying to get rid of. And so the challenge for all of us is that, having seen the private sector do that when it was deregulated and was allowed to create as much money as it wanted, how do we kind of put the genie back in the bottle for the private sector? And then the question is, what is the role for publicly created credit? And I think the IMF has been leading the debate around that as to what is the role for publicly created credit. And all credit to them that they've led that debate. The other debate I think that the IMF has been very instrumental in has been around green economics. And so they've kind of been doing it in combination with the OECD and the World Bank and the United Nations, I guess. All the kind of international institutions are very engaged in the green economic debate. And what they've been saying is, how do we make the transition towards sustainability while still maintaining prosperity? And that is the kind of global debate we have, because we're trying to make this transition to sustainability, which is quite a radical change in our economy, at the same time as we're dealing with essentially a financial crisis, which has become a crisis of the real economy as well because of the impacts of the financial system. So in the midst of this financially created crisis, we're also trying to deal with the ecological crisis, if you like. And so we've got these two parallel problems, and the IMF has been leading some of the work about how we can both deal with the environmental crisis by trying to build the green economy and make sure that we make the transition to sustainability, but also deal with the crisis in the real economy by making sure we have jobs in sustainable industries and making sure that people have sustainable work. And getting both of those things right, I think, is the great challenge of our epoch. And I've certainly appreciated the IMF's contribution on that. And so I look forward to further rational debate about these issues in our Parliament.
David Bennett.
And then there's David
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope